Today's deep dive is into a concept called the architecture of aversion. And we're pulling this from texts that are really deeply rooted in liberation psychology.
Right.
And our mission today is to explore a framework that takes pretty much everything modern society assumes about human identity
Mm.
and it just flips it entirely upside down.
It really does. Yeah.
Because usually, when we talk about human identity, we expect it to be this fixed GPS coordinate. Like you look at a map, you see the little blue dot, and you say, okay, there it is. That's who I am.
Right. It feels binary. It feels concrete.
Exactly. It's clean. And honestly, I mean, it's comforting. We like things to be inherent, right? To be categorized as these natural facts of our biology.
Because if a trait is a natural fact, it's out of our hands. It gives us this sense of permanent grounding in a very chaotic world.
Yeah, but when you step into the sources we are looking at today, that GPS system is completely broken.
Oh,
The map is gone. We are navigating a psychological landscape that is incredibly murky, deeply unsettling, and heavily rooted in the Wilsonian school of thought, drawing specifically on the frameworks of Dr. Amos Wilson.
right. And for those who might not be familiar, Dr. Amos Wilson was a theoretical psychologist who focused heavily on the psychological impact of systemic racism and oppression. So his framework looks at behavior not just as, individual choices, but as complex long-term reactions to hostile environments. He was really interested in how power structures manipulate the developing mind.
Which brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. And before we dive into the specific mechanics of this theory, we really have to pause and set the stage here, because the claims made in these texts are, well, they're heavy.
They are more than heavy. They're absolute paradigm shifters. And we really need to lay down some very clear ground rules for this exploration. The framework we're analyzing today contains highly charged political, social, historical, and psychological claims. I mean, it touches on race, sexuality, severe trauma, and systemic oppression.
All the heavy hitters.
Exactly. So we want to make it crystal clear to everyone listening right now, we are not here to endorse, validate, or take sides on these viewpoints.
Right. Our goal isn't to tell you if this theory is right or wrong.
Precisely. Our role today is strictly analytical. We are acting as your guides to impartially unpack the mechanics of this specific school of thought.
Yeah.
We just want to understand what the author's arguing, how they construct their argument, and the internal logic of this framework. We're looking at the blueprint of their theory, regardless of how provocative it is.
Hold on. I want to make sure I'm setting this up correctly for the listener, because the sheer scale of the claim here is staggering.
It is.
If the mainstream view of identity is like that fixed GPS coordinate you were born with, this theory is arguing that certain identities are actually more like a defensive fortress built after a devastating hurricane.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. It is framing identity not as a biological North Star, but as a reactive adaptation to a deeply hostile environment. So it's a survival mechanism wearing the mask of nature.
Which is a profound departure from the current cultural narrative. I mean, we live in an era of affirmation. The prevailing logic is that discovering your identity is about unearthing your true, innate self.
Right. Living your truth.
Exactly.
Right.
But the Wilsonian framework suggests that what we often celebrate as a true self might actually be the scar tissue left behind by systemic trauma.
Wow. And to really ground this incredibly abstract, heavy psychological theory, the authors don't just leave it in the realm of academia, right?
Surely don't.
They take us to a very specific physical and brutal environment where they claim this architecture of aversion is most visible, and that environment is the American prison system.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the broader psychological landscape, the prison system operates as the ultimate pressure cooker. It's a hyper-masculine, hyper-violent, rigidly structured environment. And under this theoretical framework, it serves as the perfect petri dish to observe the mechanics of what they call cognitive reversal.
The sources bring up these fascinating anecdotal accounts to illustrate this too. They mention figures like Sleece Johnson, who is somewhat notorious in prison documentary culture.
Right.
And the analysis uses these extreme examples to highlight an intense duality of existence that inmates navigate every single day. Let's paint a picture of the outside facade first.
So the outside facade is a rigorous, almost theatrical performance of traditional patriarchal masculinity.
Okay.
Picture the visitation room. When the mothers, the wives, the children come to the facility, the inmate projects this impenetrable aura of strength.
They're lifting weights, they're talking about protecting the family, they're enforcing discipline from behind the glass. They are playing the role of the unbroken patriarch to the hilt. And under this framework, This isn't just a guy putting on a brave face so his mom doesn't worry. It's a desperate, calculated maintenance of a specific identity for the outside world.
But the analysis notes a drastic, almost instantaneous shift that happens the moment visitation hours end.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the moment that visitation room door clicks shut, the family leaves, and the inmate walks back to the cell block, the patriarchal facade evaporates.
The architecture of aversion takes over.
Exactly.
The authors describe a sudden shift to a situational reality within the cell block, one that is often defined, in their own words, by the arms of another man. The stark contrast between the hypermasculine protector in the visiting room and the reality inside the cell is what they call the prison paradox.
And what's fascinating here is how the Wilsonian critique interprets this paradox. Because conventional wisdom usually looks at prison sexuality and says, well, it is a single-sex environment.
Right? It's situation.
Right. They say it's a situational adaptation based purely on proximity and the deprivation of heterosexual contact. It's often dismissed as just a temporary response to being locked in a cage.
But the framework aggressively rejects that idea, doesn't it?
It completely dismantles it. The theory insists this behavior isn't just about the physical proximity of being incarcerated. The argument is that the prison cell is merely the greenhouse, where a psychological seed, which was planted long, long ago, finally finds the perfect, unconstrained conditions to bloom.
Wait,
Yeah.
so the prison environment didn't create the psychological dynamic, it just removed the societal constraints that were forcing the individual to hide it.
Exactly.
Wait, so if the assertion is that this isn't just situational survival born from being locked up, what exactly is the seed that was planted before they ever put on a prison uniform?
That question brings us directly into the core mechanics of Dr. Amos Wilson's concept of cognitive reversal. To understand the seed, we have to examine the soil it was planted in. And according to this theoretical model, that soil is severe systemic trauma experienced during childhood development.
So the sources specifically zero in on sexual abuse and pederasty, which is the abuse of children by adults, as the primary tools used by systemic power structures to redirect the natural psychological growth of an individual.
Yes.
And this is framed specifically within the context of the African psyche and systemic oppression.
The underlying argument is that this kind of profound violation isn't just an isolated criminal act of violence. It functions as a structural mechanism of psychological warfare.
Wow.
It's designed to derail normal human development. And the framework breaks down this derailment, this cognitive reversal, into 3 distinct progressive stages.
I want to walk through these stages carefully because this is where the actual mechanics of the theory come into focus. And it gets incredibly dark.
It does.
Stage 1 is termed the inversion of value. How does that actually work in a developing brain?
So think about a healthy developmental environment. A child naturally associates intimacy with safety, love, and protection. Pain and violation are recognized as threats to be avoided. The compass needle points north, so to speak.
Makes sense.
But when a developing mind experiences severe, inescapable sexual trauma, that fundamental wiring gets crossed. The child's brain, operating as a sheer survival mechanism to prevent total psychological collapse, begins to associate intimacy directly with violation.
It's an extreme coping strategy. Like if the trauma is inescapable, the mind eventually reorganizes itself to seek pleasure in the very patterns that originally caused the pain.
Exactly.
It's a way for the victim to subconsciously try to regain control over the violation. Like if I seek it out, then I am not a helpless victim. I am a participant.
Precisely. The compass needle flips entirely south. The pain becomes the baseline for connection.
So if their brain wires itself to associate pain with intimacy just to survive, what happens when they eventually escape that abuse and encounter a normal, loving environment? Do they just snap back to normal once they are safe?
You would hope so, but tragically, the theory suggests the exact opposite. And that brings us to what the authors call the second stage, which is the rejection of health.
This part is so devastatingly ironic. I mean, you would think someone who has experienced such chaos would crave stability.
You would. But because once the inversion of value has taken place, the traumatized psyche feels entirely alienated from normalcy. Stability, healthy affection, and traditional family structures actually begin to feel deeply threatening to the victim.
Why threatening, though? If someone loves you in a healthy way, why does that trigger a threat response?
Because a healthy environment demands a version of the self that the traumatized individual feels they no longer possess. To exist in a healthy family structure requires vulnerability, trust, and a standard baseline of intimacy that the victim's brain now registers as dangerous.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. When vulnerability has historically led to severe violation, being vulnerable with a loving partner feels like walking into a trap.
It's like trying to plug a 220-volt appliance into a 110-volt outlet. The system just violently rejects it.
Exactly right.
The trauma-rooted individual looks at a stable family life and feels a profound sense of imposter syndrome and panic. They cannot inhabit that space because their internal wiring now requires chaos, or at least the power dynamics of violation, to feel normal.
Yeah.
So they push away health because health acts like a mirror, highlighting exactly how broken they feel inside.
That is the tragedy of the second stage. They become architects of their own continued isolation. But the theory doesn't stop at individual psychology. It zooms out to historical sociology for the third stage.
Okay.
And this is where we encounter what the framework calls the adoption of the German invention.
This is one of the most provocative historical claims in the material. The theory points its finger directly at late 19th century Western psychiatry, which, as we know, much of it was pioneered in Germany and Europe.
Right. According to the Wilsonian perspective, prior to this era, the behaviors resulting from cognitive reversal were largely understood as actions. They were behaviors a person engaged in. But 19th century psychiatry introduced a completely new paradigm. It created what the text calls a clinical cage. It took these trauma responses, these inverted behaviors, and categorized them as a fixed innate identity.
Wow.
The concept of the homosexual as a distinct biological category of human being was heavily popularized during this specific historical window.
It almost sounds like a bone that breaks, but is never set properly by a doctor. It heals crooked. And eventually the person adapts to walking with a severe limp to the point where they think, this is just my natural walk. I was born with this limp.
Yeah.
But the theory is saying, no, that is not your natural walk. That's just the architecture of an unhealed fracture. The text is essentially arguing that psychiatry looked at that crooked bone, put a scientific frame around it, called it a permanent identity, and effectively froze the person in their trauma response.
That is a perfect analogy for this framework. By clinicalizing the trauma response as an innate identity, the psychiatric establishment effectively told the victim, you aren't broken. You aren't reacting to something terrible that happened to you. This is simply the biological North Star you were born with.
Which, on the surface, sounds like incredible acceptance. It sounds like progress. But under this specific theoretical lens, it is viewed as a horrific trap.
Exactly.
Because if it's an innate identity, you can't cure it. You can't heal from it. You just have to live in it. It transforms a potential wound to be mended into an unchangeable nature to be celebrated. It locks the door to the clinical cage and throws away the key.
And if 19th century psychiatry built the clinical cage, the framework argues that mid-20th century institutions threw a massive tarp over the whole thing to make sure no one could even see the bars.
Okay.
This brings us to a highly specific, very controversial mechanism the authors call linguistic camouflage.
Yes, the focus shifts here from psychology to theology and linguistics. The sources specifically cite the 1946 translation of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the RSV, as a pivotal moment of what they term linguistic fraud.
Right.
Let us unpack what actually happened in 1946 according to this theory, because it really blew my mind how a single translation choice could supposedly cascade through an entire culture.
Let's trace that out. Before 1946, many English translations of the Bible used terms that, while archaic, were closer to the original Greek concepts they were translating.
Okay.
One specific Greek word in question historically referred to pederasty, which is the systemic abuse of young boys by older men, which was a documented cultural practice in the Greco-Roman world.
It was an action, a specific crime of a powerful adult violating a vulnerable child.
Correct. But the framework claims that the committee working on the 1946 RSV made a fateful decision. They merged that specific Greek term for pederasty, along with other terms, into a brand new, incredibly broad English word that had never appeared in a Bible translation before.
And that word was homosexuality.
Yes.
They took a word describing the abuse of a minor and folded it into a modern psychiatric term that describes a general sexual orientation. And the theory argues this wasn't just a clumsy translation error. It was a systemic maneuver that achieved two massive overlapping cultural goals.
The first goal, according to the analysis, was the protection of the predator.
Walk the audience through the causal chain of that. How does changing a word in a Bible in 1946 protect a predator decades later?
Think about the cultural weight of the Bible in the mid-20th century. It functioned as the moral baseline for Western society. By changing the word in the most widely read moral text, the system fundamentally shifted the cultural conversation.
Oh, wow.
It moved the focus entirely away from the horrific specific act of an adult violating a child and turned the whole thing into a theological, political, and eventually psychological debate over orientation.
It provided the ultimate alibi. If the religious text condemns a broad orientation, the spotlight is removed from the predatory actions of adults. The predator gets to hide in the semantic confusion. The debate becomes about two consenting adults loving each other, rather than the historical reality of exploitation that the original Greek text was actually addressing.
The sleight of hand there is staggering when viewed through this lens, but it gets darker because the second systemic goal achieved by this translation was the validation of the reversal.
Right. The impact on the victim.
Exactly. If we tie this back to the traumatized child, the victim of the inversion of value we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
this individual grows up with an inverted attraction pattern drawn to the dynamics of their own violation. And when they look to society for answers, what do they find?
They find the camouflage.
Right. The religious texts dictate the moral baseline, which influences the psychiatric diagnostic manuals of the era, which then trickles down into pop culture and everyday language.
So by the time that traumatized teenager in the 1980s or 90s tries to understand why they feel the way they do, the culture has completely absorbed this linguistic shift. They hear from the church, from the therapist, and from the media that this isn't a psychological fracture resulting from a crime committed against them. They're told it is just an innate identity.
The linguistic shift reinforces the clinical cage. It tells the victim that their profound trauma-induced disorientation is simply who they inherently are.
So putting the pieces together, the theory is arguing that by changing the language at the top of the cultural pyramid, the overarching system managed to simultaneously hand the predator an impenetrable alibi and hand the victim a false permanent identity that prevents them from ever seeking healing.
That is the essence of the linguistic fraud the authors are outlining. It's a camouflage that protects the architecture of aversion from ever being dismantled. It ensures the broken bone stays crooked forever.
Okay, this brings up a massive question of motive. We've looked at the psychological mechanics, like how the mind reverses itself. We've looked at the linguistic mechanics, how society camouflages the trauma. But why does this architecture exist in the first place, according to this school of thought? What is their ultimate systemic goal of pushing this false identity onto traumatized populations?
To understand the why, we have to look at the broader political framework of Dr. Amos Wilson. This school explicitly analyzes power dynamics through the lens of race, colonization, and systemic oppression.
Okay.
The theory argues that the ultimate goal of proliferating these trauma-based sub-identities is to serve white supremacy through a mechanism of fragmentation.
Fragmentation. Let's break that down. How does identity politics play into systemic control?
The foundational premise is that a unified, psychologically whole community is the greatest possible threat to a dominant, oppressive power structure.
Right.
If individuals are rooted in their ancestral identity, their family roles, and their community obligations, they possess the collective strength to challenge and potentially overthrow the system.
But if you can traumatize the youth of that community, trigger a cognitive reversal, and then convince them that their trauma response is actually their primary identity, you fundamentally fracture them. You divide and conquer from the inside out.
Exactly. From this Wilsonian perspective, if an individual's primary allegiance shifts to an identity defined by a trauma-born sexual preference, they are effectively decoupled from what the text calls their biological and revolutionary responsibilities to their own community.
I see.
Their energy, their politics, their social alignment all revolve around protecting and validating this sub-identity rather than dismantling the overarching structures of oppression that allow the trauma to happen in the first place.
It's a method of neutralizing a revolutionary threat.
Yes.
As the analysis suggests, the European worldview replaces functional behavior with dysfunctional identity. It takes a broken man, tells him he is not broken but merely different, and ensures he never seeks the power to mend himself.
Because if he doesn't know he's injured, he'll never look for the medicine, and if he never heals, he can never truly fight back.
Which brings us right back to the physical reality of the prison matrix, where we started this conversation.
It does.
Because the prison is where this systemic fragmentation reaches its absolute terrifying extreme. The framework explores how this plays out in the daily life of inmates, highlighting a complete and total decoupling of optics and reality.
This part of the source material was fascinating because it describes a social dynamic that operates like a horrifying funhouse mirror. It's all about the illusion of appearance. and who controls the gatekeeping of perception.
The theory outlines what it calls the dynamics of inversion within the prison yard. Remember those sexual predators we talked about? The ones the linguistic camouflage protects?
Yeah.
Inside the prison, those predators are often the ones who hold the power. And they use that power to effectively gatekeep the perception of who is considered straight.
Wait, the predators are the ones deciding who is straight. How does that work?
Well, survival in that environment dictates total concealment for anyone engaging in the architecture of aversion. You cannot afford to look vulnerable. So under this immense violent pressure, the individuals who are actively perpetuating the abuse adapt by hyper-conforming to traditional hypermasculine norms.
Oh, I see. So they lift the heaviest weights, they act the toughest, they talk the loudest about their wives and girlfriends on the outside.
Creative.
They ensure that they look entirely, unimpeachably straight to the untrained eye. They are hiding in plain sight behind a fortress of exaggerated masculinity.
Correct. They are the architects of the funhouse mirror. But then you have the exact opposite happening at the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
The framework talks about the naive individuals. These are the guys who come into the system completely oblivious to these complex predatory power dynamics. They don't know the unwritten rules. They don't realize that every glance, every posture, every word is being calculated by predators.
And because they are naive, because they aren't engaging in the hypervigilant performance of masculinity, they might be softer spoken. They might not lift weights. They might display natural human vulnerability.
Yeah.
And in this warped funhouse mirror environment, the theory argues that these oblivious, non-participating individuals are the ones who inadvertently look or present as homosexual to the rest of the yard.
They get labeled, targeted, and often victimized, precisely because they didn't know they were supposed to be wearing the camouflage.
The subversion of appearances there is just chilling.
It really is.
The structural exploitation is kept entirely hidden because the people actively perpetuating it, the predators and the deeply entrenched participants, look aggressively innocent and hypermasculine. Meanwhile, the naive, who have absolutely no part in it, end up looking guilty and bearing the brunt of the stigma and the violence.
Is a perfectly sealed ecosystem of deception. The system punishes the innocent for looking like what the guilty actually are.
And it ensures the trauma cycle continues unbroken, completely invisible to anyone who doesn't understand how the funhouse mirror is warped.
Okay, I have to be honest here. Reading through this source material, processing this matrix of trauma, false identity, linguistic fraud, fragmentation, and prison survival, it presents a relentlessly bleak picture.
It's extremely heavy.
It feels entirely inescapable. If the system is this thoroughly rigged to rewire the human soul from childhood, I have to ask, does the theory offer a way out? How does one possibly dismantle this architecture of aversion?
It is a dark framework, absolutely. It demands a lot of the reader, but the theory does dedicate its final sections to a path forward, a concept it calls reclaiming the sovereignty of the mind. And the core thesis of this liberation is returning to causality.
Returning to causality, meaning stop looking at the symptoms and start looking at the root cause.
Precisely. The argument is that true healing cannot be found in affirming the current traumatized state. Affirmation, in this context, is seen as capitulating to the clinical cage. It's telling the guy with the crooked leg that his limp is beautiful. Instead, liberation requires moving entirely beyond the modern obsession with identity and doing the grueling work of restoring a self-image that is no longer a reaction to a predator's touch.
The sources outline 3 specific steps required to achieve this mental sovereignty. The first step is interrogating the root. What does that excavation actually look like?
This is the most painful step. It requires the individual and the broader community to stop asking, "Who am I now?" and start asking, "What happened to the child before this identity emerged?"
Wow.
It is about tracking the cognitive reversal back to its exact point of origin, the moment of violation. You have to acknowledge the trauma as trauma, not as destiny.
You have to admit that the GPS coordinate you've been living at is actually the site of a disaster. You have to look at the crooked bone and admit it's broken.
Exactly.
And that leads to the second step, dismantling the facade.
Right, and this speaks directly to the prison paradox we discussed earlier. Dismantling the facade means breaking the cycle of theatrical performance. It means ending the rigid, hyper-masculine act in the visitation room and the secret situational reality in the cell. The theory argues that this performance traps not just the inmates, but their entire families in a generational web of secrets and unacknowledged pain.
The families are suffering because they're trying to relate to a hologram of a person, while the real person is trapped in the architecture of aversion behind the wall.
Yes.
Imagine being a wife or a mother trying to connect with that facade. The secrecy is what gives the trauma its power. The facade has to come down, even if the truth is devastating.
Which brings us to the final and most constructive step, restoring purpose.
Right.
Once the root is interrogated and the facade is dismantled, there is a massive psychological void. That void cannot be filled with another reactionary identity. According to the Wilsonian framework, it must be filled by realigning the psyche with ancestral strength and functional community roles.
It is about replacing the dysfunctional, trauma-born identity with functional, purposeful behavior. Becoming a true father, a true protector, a true member of the community, rather than just playing one on visitation day.
It is shifting the focus from what I feel driven to do because of my trauma to what I am obligated to do to heal and uplift my community. It's the ultimate rejection of the fragmentation we discussed earlier.
So, to synthesize this entire intense journey through the source material, the ultimate secret that inmates don't want their families to know, according to this theoretical model, isn't just about their sexual behavior behind bars.
No, it's not.
It is so much deeper and more tragic than that. The real secret is the profound psychological displacement they've suffered. It's the horrific realization that a system designed ostensibly to punish them for crimes has actually succeeded in fundamentally rewiring their human soul.
That is the tragedy at the center of the architecture of aversion. The trauma of the environment enforces a cognitive reversal that changes who they are at their core, all while society tells them they are just expressing their true identity.
And therefore, according to this framework, reversing the reversal, doing the grueling, painful work to interrogate the root and reclaim the mind, is framed as the ultimate, necessary act of true liberation.
It's not just about getting out of prison, it's about getting the prison out of the mind.
Man, that is a heavy, heavy conceptual lift.
Yeah,
This deep dive has been an incredibly intense intellectual journey.
it really has.
And again, as we said at the top, exploring challenging, highly provocative, and multi-layered perspectives like this Wilsonian framework is so valuable. Not because we have to agree with every premise, but because engaging with these ideas forces us to critically examine the narratives we accept as absolute truth.
Right.
It forces us to understand how different communities and scholars interpret the mechanics of trauma, identity, and society.
Absolutely. The true value of this exploration is in the friction it creates against our preconceived notions. It demands that we ask harder questions about the origins of behavior, the power of systemic labeling, and the long shadow of trauma.
Which brings us back to where you started. That comfortable GPS coordinate, the idea that identity is clean, fixed, and biological.
I want to leave our listeners with a final lingering thought to mull over on their own, building on the logic of the source material we just unpacked.
Lay it on us.
If this framework suggests that profound, violent trauma can be culturally repackaged over decades as an innate identity simply to serve a power structure, it begs a much larger question. How many other aspects of what modern society comfortably considers to be just human nature might actually be the invisible long-term adaptations to historical systems of control? How many of our natural coordinates are actually just fortresses we forgot we built?